know we're going for 20 minutes. Now that my phone is my camera, not my timer. And I hope this one's ticking right.
Oh, do you need a timekeeper?
If you wouldn't mind, that would be helpful.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna give you like 5-minute warning, 2-minute warning.
Great.
Yeah.
If you could just do hand signals, that'd be perfect.
Okay.
Awesome.
All right, so what we're gonna do is, first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pray for you, then you're gonna give the presentation, and then we're going to ask you questions, and then we're gonna ask you to leave, and we will consult among us and determine your future.
I love it.
Then we'll have you come back in and we will let you know your future.
Excellent. It's an important moment.
It
The
is.
future is decided in the next 20 minutes. 25.
All right, so let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for Seb. I thank you for all the work that he's put into this program. I thank you for his creativity and how he's put together all these different projects and ideas. God, I pray that you would guide him right now and help him do a really great presentation. In Jesus' name, amen.
Excellent. First off, thank you for being here. Thank you for being such excellent stewards in our program, for helping us through this project. My time at APU has gone by in a blink. It's really been incredible. I've been so grateful for this experience, all of the people, all of the classes. It's just been exceptional, so I want to thank you for that. And I'm ready to get started.
Yeah.
Awesome. So as you know, my name is Sebastian Dunbar, and today I will be presenting my thesis defense. And the name of my study is Employee Recognition and Affective Commitment, the Remote Work Factor. Let's jump right in. First, I'd like to go over a table of contents of what we'll be presenting. I'll briefly introduce my research. We'll cover my literature review, which will go over my 3 main variables. Then we'll talk about my hypothesis, the methodology I use to test these hypotheses. Then we'll go over results, the discussion of the results, as well as a bit of a deeper dive into those results with implications for practice, as well as limitations of the research and recommendations for future research. Let's jump right in. So first, to introduce my study, the research question at the core of everything is whether or not public recognition in the workplace affects effective organizational commitment, and whether that relationship is influenced by distance work. So the purpose of this study is to help organizations determine how they can develop effective recognition systems that are applicable to employees of all kinds, whether they're distance workers or fully in person, as well as how they can leverage those to create organizational effects through the lens of affective organizational commitment. And there's 3 main points of significance here. One is to fill gaps that currently exist in research on these topics. In particular, gaps in the relationship between recognition and affective organizational commitment. Second will be isolating recognition from rewards, as these 2 topics are commonly associated in research and studied at the same time, treated as one variable. And lastly, we'll be measuring the impact of work modality on these previously stated relationships. So first, I'd love to briefly go over my literature review. Talked about this a bit in the proposal, so I'll keep it a bit more brief, but I would like to share some interesting findings from the research. So first, on employee recognition. Employee recognition is defined as formal acknowledgement built on the practices of noticing and honoring, particularly in the workplace. And a key distinction here is that recognition does not equal rewards. Rewards establish a means to an end, or an instrumentality to a behavior. Reward tells an employee that if they do this certain thing, they will receive this certain thing, while a recognition functions a bit differently. It doesn't have that instrumentality. It's more of a psychological effect, and it's something that's encouraging rather than directly motivating to an end. Another great finding, briefly, on employee recognition is that it affects intrinsic motivation, whereas rewards affect extrinsic motivation a lot more. And extrinsic motivation means that employees are motivated by outside influences. An employee who is motivated intrinsically is less reliant on outside influences. So having recognition rather than rewards can really help employees be self-starters and self-motivated, which I thought was a really interesting finding in the literature review. Now, to affective organizational commitment, which is an employee's emotional attachment to their organization. This was one of the 3 forms of organizational commitment outlined by Allen and Meyer, and I chose this one in particular because it's really about emotional attachment and somebody's desire to stay with an organization, rather than an obligation, I think under continuous commitment, or a need to do it in like normative commitment. So this one I thought was a lot more closely related to the emotional aspects of recognition, and that's why I focused on it in the study. Lastly, distance work. This is something we're all very familiar with, especially in the modern workplace. Distance work is defined as employees performing their job duties outside of the traditional office space, such as a centralized office. This can be an employee working from home, anywhere they have internet access, and in some cases of work, anywhere they have cell phone access or cell reception. Distance work can take many shapes and forms. And an important part of distance work is that it is enabled by groupware and communication technologies, such as Microsoft Teams, Google Office, or Zoom. These allow distance work to occur and to fit into the workplace the same way that an in-person worker might. So at the end of my literature review, we really dug deep into how are these concepts related to one another. And there are some really interesting findings here. One is that it's assumed that there is a positive relationship between recognition and affective organizational commitment, but past research has really depended on this, depending on how recognition was defined. In some cases, recognition was defined as a vision, and there was a positive relationship. In other cases, recognition was defined as influential leadership, and there was a negative relationship. So really separating recognition from rewards and having a clearer, simpler definition of recognition really, I thought, was the best way for us to study the relationship between that and affective commitment. Another interesting finding about how these concepts are related is that recognition increases the feelings of belonging, which are closely related to the emotional attachment that characterizes affective commitment. Lastly, my research highlighted the fact that distance work may hamper the grounds or the conditions necessary for recognition to occur. A lot of research indicates that recognition occurs in interpersonal face-to-face settings, where a subordinate and their leader can interact one-on-one in a casual setting, a passing setting, in an unannounced setting. This is much harder to do for a distance worker, and it is why I wanted to focus on distance work and how it affects this prior relationship. There's two big things missing here. One, as I've mentioned, is separating rewards from recognition, which is a very important distinction. And the other is observing the impact of work modality on this total relationship. Verifying. Another groupware communication technology, key to distance work. In this case, it's in person. So I'd love to discuss my two hypotheses for this study. The first is that recognition for performance will be positively correlated with affective organizational commitment. And my second hypothesis was that this relationship between recognition and affective organizational commitment will be moderated by whether or not work is 100% distance or 100% in person. So let's talk about how we tested these two hypotheses. First, my overall study is a correlational study with an online survey. And this survey asked questions about work experiences using a 5-point Likert scale. So recognition had several question items. Affective organizational commitment had several question items. And two of these examples you can see on the page here. A sample item for employee recognition was that I received congratulations from my supervisor when I reached specific goals. And an example from affective organizational commitment was that this organization has a great deal of personal meaning to me. Think back to that emotional attachment that really defines that concept. And these two sample items, within all the other sample items, were presented to the participant along with a 5-point scale, ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So they could self-report how well they associate or how much they agree with these statements. And for work modality, the question was far simpler. It was, is your work 100% distance, yes or no? This data was sampled using social networks, work networks, personal to mine, emails that were sent out, social media, particularly work-based social media like LinkedIn, but Instagram was leveraged as well. So to dive a bit deeper into my methodology, we ended up with a total of 348 participants included in the data set. All of these participants were 18 years old or older. They were all currently employed in an organization, and the average age of the sample was 33.03. And the ages in the sample ranged from 18 all the way up to 76, so we had a very diverse and representative population with regards to age. When it comes to gender, it was almost an even split, with 50% male and 48.5% female, with the rest of that being people who prefer not to say or reported other. And the racial demographics can be seen here in figure 1, which I'll use the laser pointer to indicate, which doesn't show up on the TV, and that's quite okay. What you can see here is that the majority of my sample identified as white, followed closely, second and third place was almost a tie between Latino Hispanic and Black African American, and the fourth most common race in the sample was Asian. And to analyze this data, For the first hypothesis, we used a simple Pearson correlation, and we used multiple regression. So let's dive into these results because they're very exciting. First, in table 1, we can see the descriptive statistics of the key variables in the study. And I'll be very brief here. Simple things you can see are standard deviations and means. You can see that the means for the employee affective commitment scores and the employee recognition scores were somewhat close to the midpoint, but we'll go into a deeper analysis of this data in the next slide. You can also see the average age as well as the ranges for all of these variables. So let's discuss the results in the context of these two hypotheses. For hypothesis 1, which is again, recognition for performance will be positively correlated with affective organizational commitment. As you can see on table 2, which shows the correlations for the main variables, highlighting this box right here shows the Pearson correlation coefficient, which was a value of 0.61. And based on the sample size of my study, which was 348 participants, that yielded a p-score of less than 1,000th. This means that there was less than a 0.1% chance that these results were merely happenstance, or merely coincidental, or chance. Now for the next hypothesis, the story was a bit different. In fact, we found that the interaction term was not statistically significant. I ended up with a p-score of 0.68, which is rather large. This means that there does not seem to be much of a moderating effect of distance work on the relationship between employee recognition and affective organizational commitment. To sum it up, hypothesis 1 was supported. Unfortunately, hypothesis 2 wasn't, but this may not be as unfortunate as it sounds. So let's discuss these results. First, on the relationship in hypothesis 1 between employee recognition and affective organizational commitment. There were several findings from the study that were consistent with the prior research from the literature review. One was that non-compensatory recognition, which is what my study focused on, again, separating recognition from rewards, creates positive outcomes for organization. You can think of these positive outcomes as being motivation, performance, characterized by the positive relationship, with affective organizational commitment that also creates these outcomes. So it's really good for organizations to have this form of non-compensatory recognition. Another finding that was consistent with prior research is that both variables had a positive impact on employee performance in the prior research. Now, if these variables had opposing relationships to performance, my finding that these variables had a positive relationship with one another might have been a little bit strange. If one of them was measured to increase performance in the past and the other to decrease, if I found that they would increase with each other, that might have been a bit confusing and may have confounded the results of my study. Fortunately, both of these have a positive relationship with employee performance in all the past research that I found from the literature review, which is consistent with the positive relationship found in the study. Next, I'd like to present some of the possible explanations for why these results might be, why I found this positive relationship between these two variables. And both of these function in a direction. So in one case, recognition, which is known to increase emotional investment in an organization, may lead people to become more attached to their organization, which is the definition of affective organizational commitment. So having more recognition can lead people to be more affectively committed to their organization. The relationship may also function in the other direction, because employees who have greater degrees of affective organizational commitment or emotional attachment to their organization actually measure as having higher performance. So if an employee has higher performance, they are more likely or have more grounds where they can be recognized for that performance by their managers, which would be consistent with the findings of the study. I'd also like to briefly discuss the findings on the moderation, or lack thereof, of distance work on this aforementioned relationship. My findings were a bit inconsistent with the prior research, specifically the prior research that said distance work may make it more challenging for recognition to be delivered effectively to the end of the outcome variables that we're seeing here. It could dilute the interpersonal grounds necessary, like I said, that face-to-face, that can be really essential to employee recognition. Turns out, in this study, that wasn't the case. And employees who were distance, or self-reported as distance workers as opposed to in-person, reported about the same levels of recognition, about the same levels of affective commitment, and also relative to one another. There's several possible explanations for this. One that's front of mind is that this may be a reflection of advances in communication technologies in the aforementioned groupwares, the Microsoft Teams, the Google Suites, all of these things. They've advanced rapidly in the past couple of years, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we have seen a real drive to employee demand. Employees want more distance work and hybrid work options following the pandemic, as well as employer demand. Companies are more invested in finding these options and figuring out how they can use groupware and communication technologies to really enable remote work at a large scale. And at the end of the day, having 100% distance work versus 100% in person be this simple binary that's measured in my study may not be fully representative of a much wider spectrum of hybrid work, which is very common in the modern workplace. People may work 3 days in the office, 2 days out, 2 days in and 3 days out. Point is, there's a wide spectrum of how work modality functions in the modern workplace that wasn't represented by the study. So that's a possible explanation for why this moderation was not supported. Now I'd love to discuss some implications for practice. For managers, there's a lot of really great takeaways from this study. One is that it underscores the importance of recognizing performance. We've seen this a lot in my literature review data. Increasing recognition leads to increased performance, less absenteeism, improved employee retention. All of these things are really great for organizations and great for a manager's immediate team. Another thing is that the effect of recognition is still strong even when that recognition is non-compensatory. So managers cannot scapegoat cost or budget as a reason not to do recognition for their employees because it's still just as effective and it's still meaningful. The last takeaway or implication for managers is that a lack of moderation by distance work suggests that recognition should be prioritized for all employees, regardless of work modality. Distance workers who are far away from the immediate office setting can't be ignored when it comes to recognition because my data would show they are just as affected positively by it than employees who are in in-person settings. I'd also love to discuss some implications for consultants or consultant groups who are brought in to consult with an organization. One is that consultants can now advise organizations to be inclusive of both distance and in-person workers when they're designing complex recognition systems. A finding from my literature review was that recognition systems really require a lot of care, attention, love, and training. And it's important that consultants recommend to the organizations they're working with that they put that care, love, and training into both systems for in-person and distance workers, because the effect is just the same for both. Additionally, consultancies may suggest extra training for managers to be able to modify or port their recognition systems for distance employees, because in the grand scheme of things, while distance work is still becoming very popular, it's less common. It's seen less in the overall scale of work. So managers and training systems and organizations have more of a familiarity with how to recognize in-person workers than they do with distance workers. Lastly, I'd love to discuss some of the limitations of my study and posit some recommendations for future study. Limitations, a lot of these come down to the survey design and the fact that the survey is a bit of a constrained way to observe the relationship between a lot of these variables. An example is I use entirely self-reported measures, which have the susceptibility to introduce bias. Additionally, different participants may have interpreted the scale items differently. I tried to keep these scales fairly robust to check back for this, but interpretation is inevitable, and more complex measures may have check back for them. Additionally, social desirability bias, even in a study that's fully anonymous, inclines people to want to report their experiences more positively than negatively. Psychological concept that's very common in behavioral studies. And lastly, this study is purely correlational, so I can't truly establish a causal relationship between these two variables, which is something that future research on the subject may want to do. There were also several variables that were omitted that may have an effect on both of the variables, being recognition and affective organizational commitment. Motivation is one. Motivation is seen as an outcome variable for both of these things. It could be the thing that influences both of these directly. So observing and really measuring in motivation compared to these other two variables may be really helpful in future research to keep it more robust. Additionally, perceived leader support can definitely have an influence on both recognition and affective organizational commitment, as well as workplace culture. A culture of leadership and a support culture is really integral to effective recognition, but it's also integral to effective affective organizational commitment. So measuring these other omitted variables from this study may be really helpful for future research. And lastly, I'd like to posit some other recommendations. One is to, as I mentioned, explore hybrid work models, create a more robust way of observing and measuring this relationship of distance work, and define distance work in different ways rather than a simple binary. I'd also recommend using an experimental design in the future. For example, you could manipulate levels of recognition from a leader to really get a more specific and accurate read on how it affects affective commitment. I would also recommend segmenting employee groups to see if different groups within an organization or different job functions experience these dynamics separately. Maybe reporting that as a piece of data to make the data more robust, or separating it into different samples entirely. And lastly, I would recommend a mixed methods approach. You could introduce qualitative methods such as surveys or focus groups to really get an idea of how employees would characterize how they feel about the relationship between recognition and how emotionally attached they are to their organization, which is affective commitment. And I thank you all for listening. This concludes my presentation.
All right, very good, Seth. Really clear, excellent, good job. Okay, so now we're gonna ask you some questions, and Dr. O, would you like to begin?
So I really appreciate your presentation. I was able to see that you had a really clear understanding of your results specifically. So that was a really big strength in your presentation. I have several suggestions and I have one question. So the first suggestion is that I think the biggest limitation, one of the biggest limitations in your study was that the remote workers only like 15% of the entire population, right? So since you have unequal like kind of like distribution between remote workers and in-person workers, it was pretty obvious that you have no interaction effect because the number was pretty small. So I think you should note such a limitation in the limitation section because that can really create, that could have created different results for your specifically moderation. And the minor suggestion is that you mentioned that according to p-score, but that's pretty unusual. We say p-value instead of p-score. I know it's a really minimal thing, but we barely say like p-score, so it should be always p-value. The last suggestion is, I know it's a really super minimal, but I don't know why, but the colors, the background colors of the presentation were a little too bright. So I wasn't able to really read the size. I nearly have a little headache. Maybe it was me. Did you feel the same way?
No, I didn't notice.
No? Oh, the colors, the background colors were a little bright. It was like bright blue, bright like red. Yeah, so I think you can choose different colors to just little increase readability. I know it's a really small thing, but yeah, I just wanted to let you know. So with that being said, my suggestion is that, so even though remote work is really relevant to this research model, but you end up having no significant interaction effect, right? So do you have any other variables in mind that can possibly modify or change the relationship between recognition and affective commitment?
One that really came to mind was perceived leader support. I think in my research, recognition can feel very flat depending on how distributed the recognition is. And there seems to be a bit of a sweet spot with how exclusive recognition is. So you want it to be somewhat exclusive so it doesn't feel like a participation trophy, which isn't as motivating for employees, but you don't want it to be so exclusive that it seems like it's unattainable. So perhaps introducing perceived leader support with scale items that are related to the prevalence of recognition or kind of the overall scale of it could be helpful. It could be a matter too of getting really closer to the definition of recognition and being more specific with how we're measuring that.
Okay, so that was all from my end.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, I got a few questions here. One, in your final recommendations, you suggested doing an experiment where you manipulate recognition in organizational context. Do you think that would be ethical?
Maybe in a purely lab study where employees were separated from their normal course of work and it was a bit depersonalized. Maybe they were producing widgets for the widget factory and they were given scale items that were relevant only to their experience within this experimental design rather than experience in their outside workplace. I think that it could be more ethical. But I agree that it is a bit challenging to think of how you would manipulate those variables.
Yeah, that's why we don't do experiments in organizational psychology very often.
Fair enough.
Yeah. All right, okay. So, so we've got the two modalities, online, fully on, in place. recognition is important for both of them. Do you think there are more appropriate ways to grant recognition online and more appropriate ways for recognition in person? And if so, what are they?
Can you tell me what you mean by appropriate?
Or like effective?
Yeah, effective.
What are more effective like strategies?
That's a great question. In my own organization, I've experienced a lot of kind of the flexibility between how do we celebrate a distance worker the same way that we celebrate an in-person worker. With an in-person worker, you can bring pastries and everyone can eat together and you can have that sort of camaraderie. In a distance situation, you may need to rely a lot more on the advances of these communication technologies. So it could be a matter of using poll technologies. For example, in a Zoom call, you can create a poll where everyone could guess who, like a 2 truths and 1 lie about your fellow employee, where you can interact using that technology in a way that's not descriptive, but it's engaging. And I think that those technologies can really make up for the deficits of not being able to interact face-to-face. A physical space, I think in a lot of ways, the advantages of a physical space can be recreated in a virtual space if you really take care of what you're trying to do, how you're trying to do it, and you make it exciting and engaging.
Mm-hmm. Can you think of how you could do that on Teams or Zoom?
I love polls. You can do games and quizzes. You could integrate a Kahoot, for instance. You could use a Pictionary game where people are able to interact with each other in real time rather than like over the course of time. I think the important part of being able to be face-to-face is that we can react to one another immediately. And we can't have a handshake on Zoom, but we could both put up our little high five emojis at the same time, and that could create a full screen effect that everybody can see. So our interaction created an outcome that others can observe the same way that it could in person, but entirely virtually.
Mm-hmm. So how would a game or something like that relate to recognition?
Relate to recognition? That's a great question. I think a great way to recognize is to celebrate. My research would indicate that publicly, the public nature of recognition is an important dimension in a lot of ways. So you could hold a surprise meeting for an employee on the team where everybody else knows it's coming, but that employee doesn't. So it's almost like a surprise party where they're recognized for performance-related accomplishments. That could be something that's really strong. It could be where a bunch of different people on the team are writing cards or writing little fun facts or putting pictures of key moments that they had together of exciting work accomplishments, and then they celebrate that in that virtual call. So this person's being recognized for their performance in a social setting, in real time, in a way that's unannounced. And all of those variables are what my research indicates is really relevant to employee recognition that's effective.
Okay, that sounds good. All right. Okay, so we're gonna ask you to leave the room now, and don't go too far, but we'll come out and get you in a while.
Great, thank you. I'll take my camera with me.
Oh yeah.